Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. The global landscape feels incredibly volatile right now. We're seeing dynamics unfold that are really reshaping international relations almost in real time. And, at the heart of a lot of that complexity is the Iran-Israel conflict. So today, we're taking a deep dive into this really crucial situation, looking at its far-reaching implications. Our goal here is to, unpack the historical context, understand the very high stakes right now, and explore these fundamental shifts we're seeing in global power, international law, how it all operates now.
Exactly. And as we get into it, we'll find some, frankly, surprising insights into what actually makes a state legitimate on the world stage today, and even how the idea of war itself has profoundly changed. It's not what it used to be.
Okay, so let's start with Iran's historical position on compromise, because it's often overlooked, isn't it? Iran had actually on several occasions shown a willingness to compromise before things got to this point.
That's absolutely right. Before U.S. President Trump pulled out of that previous agreement, the JCPOA, Iran was actively part of a deal many saw as working. That arrangement meant, the constant presence of IAEA inspectors, International Atomic Energy Agency, right there on Iranian soil. They were the international community's eyes and ears monitoring the nuclear program. Under that deal, Iran agreed not to enrich uranium above a really minimal level, way below weapons grade. And importantly, Iran was sticking to the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear state. They explicitly said they had no intention of getting nuclear weapons. And the key thing back then, pretty much all parties seemed satisfied. It was, a functioning mechanism.
But that feels like a lifetime ago now. We're in a completely different situation, a real impasse. And from the perspective of Israel and the U.S., it seems like compromise now is tied directly to wanting regime change in Iran, nothing less.
Yes. And you just have to look at the demands from U.S. President Trump. He called for unconditional capitulation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's just not a basis for compromise, is it? It's an ultimatum. When you refuse to even negotiate under those kinds of terms, you're basically shutting the door on diplomacy. It signals, look, we're not looking for a deal, we want surrender. That completely changes the game. So the question of whether compromise is even possible now seems to hinge on Iran just showing it can hold out against this pressure.
Okay, so let's play that out. If Iran does manage to hold its ground, what does that force the other side to do? What would a compromise even look like then? And, how would that shift things?
Well, it's ironic, isn't it? If Iran shows it can withstand the pressure, then compromise becomes perhaps the only way forward. But for Israel and the U.S., especially those pushing for regime change, that outcome would be seen as a total catastrophe. I mean, think about the questions they'd face. Why was Israeli territory hit by rockets? Why did this whole thing escalate when there was a working agreement already in place? It would completely undermine the reason for taking such an aggressive stance in the first place. And the deeper implications, well, they're huge. A compromise like that wouldn't just question the strategy, it could seriously damage U.S. authority in the Middle East again. For some, it might even echo the perceived defeat after Vietnam, a major setback. And for Israel, it would erode that myth of invincibility, maybe for the second time, really, after what Hamas demonstrated on the ground.
Right, the reliance on demonstrating strength is so critical for Israel's whole security posture. So not getting a clear win, especially when the stated goal was changing Iran's leadership, that would absolutely be seen as a catastrophic failure, militarily, politically, reputationally. All of it.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating when you look at Israel's history in the Arab world. Despite peace treaties, diplomatic moves, there's still this fundamental, deep-seated hostility from many sides. So any perceived weakness on Israel's part is just incredibly dangerous for them. For decades, their strategy has been about projecting overwhelming strength, military superiority. And it worked, historically. But that strategy is really vulnerable the moment that strength isn't constantly proven, when it doesn't look like the clear victor. The second it seems unable to get a decisive win or even just avoids defeat, that whole aura of invulnerability starts to fade. And that's crucial for their deterrence.
And we can't forget that that lost opportunity after the Oslo Accords with Rabin, right?
Exactly. That was a potential path towards a political, peaceful resolution. But when Rabin was assassinated, it pushed Israel away from that path, back towards relying mainly on force. But the reality is, Israel can't win every single time, especially against adversaries that are just much bigger demographically, economically, financially in the region.
And its ability to maintain that position relies so heavily on U.S. support, doesn't it? Financial and military.
Absolutely crucial. It simply cannot sustain constant confrontation on its own against the growing power of various regional actors. And there's another factor, too. Israeli society itself is changing. Today's citizens aren't the generation that fled the Holocaust, where building the state was purely about survival. Many younger Israelis are used to a certain comfort, a certain security. They feel deeply uncomfortable, vulnerable when rockets start landing in their cities. It's just a different mindset than earlier generations forged in conflict. And that creates a real internal vulnerability, affects resolve.
So it really does sound like this creates a kind of time-stretched catastrophe for Israel if Iran manages to prevail, or even just endure without collapsing. The quick blitzkrieg victory they might have hoped for hasn't happened, and long wars are exactly what Israel, with its small, dense territory and vulnerable economy, has always tried to avoid. The longer it goes on without a clear win, the worse the pressure gets. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about how legitimacy and international law themselves seem to be, well, shifting. We saw that Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni calling for the overthrow of Iran's Ayatollah regime. How does that square with, say, how the overthrow of Yanukovych in Ukraine back in 2014 was welcomed by many in the West? What's going on with this idea of legitimacy?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because legitimacy today often seems less about objective facts and more like a subjective tag that powerful nations stick on regimes they don't like. We saw it with Gaddafi in Libya, Assad in Syria, Mubarak in Egypt. They were all declared to have lost legitimacy. But this wasn't based on, say, opinion polls or democratic mandates. It was decided by influential external actors. It's basically a way to say, we don't like this government, we want them gone, but frame it as, oh, their own people don't like them anymore, so they're illegitimate and our intervention is justified. It reframes intervention.
And this ties into why conflicts now are often called special operations, not wars.
Exactly. Two main reasons for that rhetorical shift. First, under post-WWII international law, the UN Charter, officially declaring war makes you the aggressor, automatically, even if you claim self-defense. That carries huge legal weight and international condemnation, which states obviously want to avoid. Second, modern politics often needs faster action than old parliamentary war declarations allow. Executives can move much quicker now, often bypassing legislatures.
Right, that executive speed is key. But what about the Kosovo precedent? How did that feed into all this?
Kosovo, that's a big one. When the West recognized Kosovo's independence, arguing Serbia had lost legitimacy to govern it due to its actions, that set a major international precedent. And what's striking is how Russia, for example, explicitly pointed to that precedent to justify its actions in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and later Ukraine. When Western countries were challenged on why Kosovo was supposedly unique, the argument often seems circular. It's unique because, well, it's unique, which just highlights the inconsistency, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sounds like double standards.
Which fuels accusations of hypocrisy and undermines the whole idea of consistent international law. It really brings us to what seems like a core principle driving things now. If I want it to be so, then it is so. Raw strength seems to dictate reality more than established laws or treaties. Legal justifications, claims of lost legitimacy, they often come after the fact. They rationalize decisions already made by force.
Like with NATO expansion.
Exactly. Promises were apparently made by some Western leaders not to expand eastward after the Cold War. Later, those were disregarded. The explanation was often just, well, the situation changed. It shows how agreements can just be tossed aside when power dynamics shift and you just create a new explanation.
So the takeaway feels pretty stark. Agreements, norms, they're becoming secondary to power. Threats, sanctions, even from smaller countries.
Yeah.
It signals an erosion of international law. War, or any big military action, seems to just reset the rules. New rights get established by whoever comes out on top. Might makes right, essentially.
It seems that way. And connecting this back to the Iran situation, the immediate danger is that Israel's initial confidence seems to have evaporated pretty quickly. Remember, just 5 days into the conflict, their own military leadership revised the timeline from days to weeks. That wasn't forced on them, it was their assessment. It really suggests they overestimated their ability for a quick win and seriously underestimated Iran's resilience.
And that dynamic is deeply alarming because, as you said, both leaderships see defeat as a catastrophe.
Right. For Iran, it's regime survival. For Israel, it's about deterrence, national security in a very tough neighborhood. That kind of high-stakes thinking could push them to use every single tool they have to avoid losing. which is particularly worrying when you remember Israel has, an undeclared but significant nuclear arsenal. That makes the whole thing incredibly risky, could spiral very badly.
And that risk hasn't gone unnoticed by the big global players, has it?
Yeah, absolutely not. Both China and Russia have been very explicit, voicing deep concerns about the possibility of nuclear war here. And you have to understand, Beijing and Moscow don't make statements like that lightly. It's not common. For them, nuclear war in this context likely implies a conflict involving nuclear powers. And with U.S. President Trump having previously threatened Iran, there's a real fear the U.S. could get dragged in deeper, potentially pitting nuclear states against each other indirectly or even directly.
And Iran is strategically vital for both China and Russia, isn't it?
Hugely important. For China, Iran is a key transit hub for trade routes to Europe and the Middle East, a big economic partner, an energy supplier. Think Belt and Road Initiative. For Russia, Iran is a critical state right on its southern flank, influencing the Caucasus, Central Asia, both vital areas for Moscow. So the bottom line is, if the U.S. were to get more involved militarily, it would almost certainly trigger a more active response, maybe an unknown level of support from China especially. That makes the concerns coming out of Beijing and Moscow very, very significant.
So wrapping this up, what does it all mean? We've looked at how compromise seems so hard to reach between Iran and Israel right now, how catastrophe itself is now defined by whether you achieve your stated goals, regardless of the cost sometimes, and how international legitimacy and law seem to be bending more and more to raw power.
Yeah, and it leaves us with a really important question, doesn't it? In a world where it feels like strength decides everything, what are the actual long-term costs of these short-term military fixes? And maybe more fundamentally, can a global order based just on power rather than consistent rules or diplomacy ever really be stable?
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.